Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight we will be doing another user submission. This one sent in, this is his alias, by the way. You've probably seen him in the comments. It's Hugo Fuck Yourself, and it sounds a lot like You Go Fuck Yourself, and that's kind of his whole... That's the whole idea. Anyway, his story is really, it's really interesting. Has to do with it when he was younger and he met these guys who had moved to their town from away. And anyway, they had brought some trouble with them with some old silverware and strange stuff that they dug up in one of the guys' yards. And I mean, this involves some pretty crazy stuff. So before we get into that, just a couple things I want to shoot out there. It has been a little while since we've had an episode up, and that is purely because my internet is intermittent, very much so right now. In fact, we're kind of gambling right now to get this episode done, and that's why we haven't started our near-death experience or cryptozoology weeks. We're going to think Shark Week, and that's what we're doing with those two topics. It's going to be 1 week, like 4 or 5 episodes on near-death experiences, and the next one is going to be like 4 or 5 episodes on cryptozoology beasts. We just haven't done it yet because my internet is so unreliable, and I am switching providers, but I'm not going to get that done until August 11th, unfortunately. So we felt best to wait until we can, be dependable with that. So we're gambling trying to get this one out there just so you have something in the meantime. And also, if you have an effed up story on the paranormal, or you have pictures or video, we'd like to get it. You can send that to us at the official site, effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. Go to the menu, hit submissions, fill out the form, hit submit. We'll get it on the website, and we'll get it into a podcast. And with that having been said, we're going to jump into Hugo's story, which on the website is titled Digging Up Trouble. So this goes back to when Hugo was in middle school, and he had met these guys, Bob and Tony, and they were brothers who were 2 years apart. And, he said they didn't really hang out until they got into high school. And they were all stoners, and they were into, drawing gravestones and crosses on their book covers. And, they listened to Ozzy and, Black Sabbath. And, those two guys had 2 older brothers, and they were named Steve and Dan. And they were also 2 years apart, but they were about 5 years older. And, they had this doom rock band. And so really... I can kind of relate a little bit to these guys. Not that I was super into drugs or anything, but I was into a lot of the heavy rock and metal and that scene. The occasional toke and stuff like that. But anyway, so this was his crew, right? And anyway, they ended up becoming close friends, Hugo and Bob and Tony, and some other guys as well. And once they were, old enough, just like a lot of us in high school, they had cars, and there's usually one person's house that everybody gathers at. Like when I grew up, just about everybody came to my house. And in this guy's case, everybody went to Bob and Tony's house, and that's where they all hung out. And anyway, the first time that Hugo went to their house, he was really creeped out by the fact that they had this creepy suit of armor, like a full suit of armor, in their house, right? And I mean, it was standing in the corner, and it even had a sword, and it was like this medieval knight, full face shield, helmet. And he said it was really creepy, I mean, this thing was complete from head to toe, and it was just a strange thing to find in somebody's house. And they told him that this statue would sometimes change its pose all on its own. And so he probed them, for half an hour to find out, what's the story behind this, movie, this possessed statue of armor. And so they gave him the backstory. And this is what they told him. They had used to live, this is Bob and Tony, they used to live in New Jersey, and this was in the 70s. And basically, they were in their backyard, and they were digging for some reason. Hugo said he didn't really remember why. Maybe they were putting in a fence or something. But anyway, as they were digging in the backyard, they started to find these burnt bricks and antique silverware. And they were really curious about why this would be in their, buried in their yard. So they ended up going to the county records in search of information. And what they found out was that the bricks and the silverware came from an old slaves' quarters that used to be on the property before, their place, right? And apparently, this old slaves' quarters burned down one night while the slaves were locked inside, and they all burned to death. And after this discovery, basically strange things started to happen to them. For example, he said one night the TV picture became three-dimensional, and you got to follow me with this to picture this, but it became three-dimensional, and it actually extended, like the image of the screen extended into the living room, and it curved up into the ceiling. And they took a picture of this, and he said, like, they actually showed it to him. Like, he saw it, and he said it was a typical early 70s living room with a box TV. He said Walter Cronkite's face was on the screen in the news, and the picture looked like a transparent deck of cards or a row of dominoes, with each being the same picture spaced apart by an inch, maybe less, coming out of the TV and curving up before disappearing into the ceiling. And I want to just note on that for a second. If you've ever taken like a video camera that was plugged into your TV, so you have a live feed, and you point that camera at your TV, you'll actually see it's like this infinite loop where you see like a screen within a screen within a screen within a screen. It just goes on. And that's what it reminds me of when he describes it as a transparent deck of cards coming out. The difference being that it wasn't in the TV. I mean, this was literally described as coming out of the TV and curving up into the ceiling. So that was really strange. And he said on this other particular night, the fireplace mantle, which was solid, suddenly collapsed, and it dropped a lot of their mother's collectible ceramic figurines on the ground, and they all shattered into this mess. So that's all Hugo really heard about Jersey, but then they moved to San Diego, and this was the mid-70s. And as soon as they moved into their new built house in San Diego, more stuff started to happen. Like they said, there's one particular night, they had this tawny dog, and he began to furiously barking at the chandelier in the entranceway. And, this entranceway was only separated from the living room by a railing. And he said that they watched as the chandelier suddenly dropped and shattered on the ground right next to the dog. It literally almost killed the dog. And then they told him about what he calls the Tom Clammett event. And so this is before, or no, not before, after. Sorry, I got that part mixed up and he corrected me. So anyway, this is the Tom Clammett event, I guess, that happened in chronological order. They met, now this is Bob and Tony's story. Like, they had met this guy when they were about 12. It was before they got into drugs and all that stuff. Their brothers were 17 or so, and is the older brothers that had this friend Tom, and they were all awoken by this Tom guy, and he was freaking out. And basically, this is what happened. The older brothers, that was Steve and Dan, were friends with their neighbor, and their neighbor was Tom. And apparently, they used to all hang out in the attic crawl space, and they would. They get high and they start doing this conjuring magic, dabbling, I guess. And one night they did some LSD and they ended up sitting up in the living room, and they said that Tom was on the couch next to that suit of armor, and he just lost it. Like he started freaking out, and he started screaming that his friend Dan was Satan, and Satan was here in the room, and he actually went so mental that the entire neighborhood woke up. And the way that it was described to Hugo was that Tom went completely medically insane and was actually kept at the psych ward for a while. He did get out eventually, but he was pretty screwed up. Forever after, we'll say. Now, Hugo admits it could have been like a bad trip that escalated into a flip out, but, this was something that, none of these guys were new to acid or stuff like that. They were very experienced, and nothing like this had happened before. And the only reason why Hugo included it in his story was because it was a significant event with a very bad energy in the house that, that Bob and Tom thought, could have been caused, I guess, by the dabbling that their brothers did with this conjuring magic. They also told them that they believed, remember I said that they dug up the stuff in their yard, right? Well, they believed that whatever they dug up, the bricks and the antique silverware, they believed that the poltergeist, I guess that was connected to this stuff actually followed them from Jersey. Because when they moved, and they brought some of the silverware with them, and the bad stuff continued to follow them. And as he was explaining the story to Hugo, in the present time, Bob actually got out one of these antique forks and showed him, and they actually, Bob and Tony had a name for this whole thing. That they used since they were kids when this had first started. Now Hugo doesn't remember exactly what it was, but they referred to it as something like the haunted silverware or whatever. But anyway, now we're going to get to Hugo's part of the story. So this is the whole past that, Bob and Tony tells Hugo when he questions this weird, bizarre suit of armor. Now Hugo's friends with these guys, and now Hugo has some experiences with them. So this starts on one night that Hugo and Bob, they were walking to Bob's house from a party, and basically this was 15 minutes away by foot, this party. And it was just, he described it as a typical SoCal suburban hood with stucco houses side by side, and a pool in every third backyard, 2 garages with each, single car length driveway. He said his house had no lawn but rocks and bonsai plants and etc., with lampposts about 4 feet in the middle of what would be the front yard. Now this is Bob's house, right? And he said nobody was at his house at the time that they, and they knew that. It was very dark. And when they approached his driveway, that lamppost that was in the middle of his front yard, he said it flashed on and on several times quickly. And he said they looked at each other, and, Hugo said he's not going in there. And he said, they got that really effed up feeling. And, Bob said, he pleaded with him, come on, go in with me. I don't want to go in alone. And then Bob just yells out, "Holy shit!" And he started running very quickly. And so Hugo didn't even know what he was running for at the time, but he ran too, like you would, because obviously something's going on. And he said that they ran to the end of the block, and Bob told him that he saw something pull the curtain back in the living room, and it was the window next to the suit of armor. And so Hugo, he decided that they both decided that they had to go back there eventually anyway. So what they did is they went to that party, and they got a couple of their friends to come back with them. And, when they went in this time, nothing really seemed strange. Like, nothing was out of the ordinary. But, Bob did kind of, go on and say that the lamppost did act up sometimes, but, the curtain thing was a different story. And, he believed that whatever happened was the work of some kind of poltergeist. And anyway, several times when they were at Bob's house and, they were tripping on LSD, they would see this, and again, like this happened several times, they would see this little green bipedal shadow form at the end of his hallway. And, they compared what they saw, and they had to accept that it was probably a ghost entity or something. Like, that's the conclusion that they came to. And on this other time, several of his friends were standing in a group talking just outside Tony's bedroom door, while Tony was getting ready to, or they were getting ready to come to Hugo's house and get him. And Tony had this chest of drawers about 3 feet tall next to his bed, and on it he had one of those fake grain or wood grain Radio Shack strobe lights with a plastic skull and a working jaw, and it had a bandana on. And anyway, Tony, he used to smoke these cigarettes, Marlboro Reds, and every time he opened a pack, he would put the first cigarette in the skull's teeth, and that would be the last cigarette that he smoked from that pack, and so on. It was like his little ritual that he did. And anyway, they were all standing there while Tony's getting ready, and Tony's about to pull his door shut when he said that the skull and with the strobe light, they just both flew into the wall and landed on the floor, and the skull came to a stop, facing the group with its mouth agape, and the strobe light landed next to it and started flashing right into the skull's face. And it was just they all took it as something strange. Tony had to go pick all that shit up, but they were all freaked out about it. And there was one other thing that happened, a major thing that happened to Bob. I think this might be my favorite thing. So this was, we're going to describe Bob's room, because this is where it happened. In Bob's room, he had he was wall-to-wall posters, from Beer of the World to Iron Maiden, Purgatory. He also had, maybe 100 little figurines of different sizes and as sources on his chest of drawers, which was about 2 feet high, maybe 4 feet long. So it was a decorated room. You got posters everywhere. You got these little, figures of different things, probably monsters, I'm assuming. And he said his room was the room that had the attic crawl space next to it, that his older brothers, if you remember from earlier, the older brothers used to do this conjure magic. That's where that Tom guy freaked out. So, Bob's room was right next to that. And anyway, sometimes these guys used to go in there and they'd, have a smoke themselves. And they go in through this. Anyway, I'm not going to go through that. But anyway, this room that Bob had was right next to that. And he did mushrooms one night. And he said, as he was lying in his bed trying to go to sleep, and this is important to remember, Hugo said that they did very heavy doses of LSD together. They had experiences, but nothing, was ever hallucinated that they ever believed was reality ever. They were experienced with this stuff. They knew what the high was supposed to feel like. They knew, that's important to remember, because the first thing that people are going to think with these things is, oh, well, it's because you're high, you're hallucinating. but that's the point that he's trying to make in this story, is that it's not that, it's different. Anyway, yeah, he actually elaborates on that and says that, he'd experienced spatial distortion and the typical, I thought that coat was a dog for a second and kind of laugh about it. But that's about it. I mean, that's as far as it goes. So anyway, Bob's lying there and he said, he had some really bad energy that came from the attic. And every poster and every figurine became vividly animated and began tormenting him. And I thought that was really interesting. The posters, the figurines, they all became very vividly animated and began to torture him badly. So the trip's not going well. And, Bob said he wasn't really hallucinating before at all. He wasn't really feeling any higher at this particular point either. Like he doesn't, he doesn't attribute this to the high at all. Like he knows where he was to. He knows how he was feeling. This is not what it was. He said this was real. And as the room came to life and just taunted him and picked at him, he said he just endured it, because it's not like he could just go tell his parents or anything, and then he'd have to admit that he had done this drugs and stuff. And they probably wouldn't believe him anyway. And he said, Tony wasn't there to help him. He just had to lie there. He just had to lie there all that night and endure it. And he said he had no explanation other than to empathize that he was not hallucinating, and it wasn't because of the mushrooms. Or emphasize, sorry. He was truly affected by this experience, by the way. Hugo said that he actually became more religious for a while. He said he didn't really go to church or anything like that, but he just started to check in on his maker, that kind of thing. He had this go to the good kind of reaction from it. And there was one other little side note that Hugo had on there, where he said that their mother was a Spanish Catholic, and she was very devout. And apparently she had a Virgin Mary figurine on her desk, and this figure would actually move around. He doesn't know if she ever saw it move, but the brothers had confirmed to him that that was the case. So that is Hugo's story. I mean, Ryan, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, it's very interesting litany of events. Here we have some very seemingly poltergeist-like activity with, the chandelier and the skull, the strobe, and even to the suit of armor. The links with what we could most definitely consider angry spirits, if there were spirits of slaves. I do think that they wouldn't necessarily be at rest if they were somehow connected to all this. I mean, there's really a hodgepodge, I guess, of things all connected up here. You got guys doing mind-altering substances and performing summoning rituals or conjuring rituals, possibly in the presence of haunted objects, just a whole lot of things all mixed up together. I guess the first thing to really address would be the hallucinogens. Now, I know immediately everybody's thought on the mushrooms and the LSD is going to be, the story, just throw it right out the window, because obviously it was all just a hallucination. Everything can be attributed to the fact that they were doing what people consider mind-altering drugs or hallucinogenics. And I mean, unless you've done these things yourself, I don't think you're really qualified to outright dismiss it. Because I mean, I could tell you from experience that LSD and mushrooms, they don't like he explained, where you'd look at something for a second, a coat that was like hanging on the arm of a chair, and you'd be like, Jesus, how did a dog get in here? And you realize it was just a brown jacket. For a moment, you thought it was a dog. Or you're looking at a pattern on the wallpaper. The pattern seems to be, crawling or moving or waving a little bit. I mean, that's really the extent of a hallucination when you're on acid or mushrooms. When it comes to objects and pictures fully, animating and, I thought it was interesting they didn't really go into detail about how they were tormenting him. There was a lot of detail about a lot of different things, but not a lot of detail on the whole tormenting aspect. And I guess, after reading the story and then, listening to you tell it again there and kind of just absorbing and thinking about it, I guess I've kind of come to, or I'm kind of the mind that we have a perfect storm of events, and so we have these objects that may or may not have some connection to restless spirits. So right there, you already have you're already introducing a wild card into your home, into this situation. Now, I really do believe that hallucinogenic substances, they can alter perception in a way that doesn't necessarily make you see falsehood. That in some cases, it could help you see things as they are, or open you up to what we would call a paranormal experience. So, you already have this haunted object, this kind of energy that's floating around. You're actively seeking to summon something. So now you're opening a doorway that way. And like we talked about earlier about the DMT experiment, off the air, as we say. We were having a discussion about DMT and the experiments that were performed. The door, right? The doors of perception. That was the name of the book that was written about the experiment. And I really do feel that hallucinogenic substances in certain situations can be used like that. It opening a door into the mind. So if you're, surrounded by this kind of paranormal energy, perhaps a spirit, you're, opening up doorways or contacting entities in these other realms, and then also opening these doorways in your own mind with substances. And I mean, I'll just say for the record, I spent years doing really intense meditations, and through all that time, I didn't partake in any drugs or alcohol at all, and I was very devoted to my meditations. And there were times when I achieved these bizarre states of mind, and of body, because there were some definite physical sensations that were just completely undescribable for me. There was nothing that I could relate it to when I was trying to explain it to people. The kind of sensations that I felt, and the kind of head spaces that I would get myself into with these really intense meditations. And it wasn't until years and years and years later, when I first, began experimenting with hallucinogenics. I'm not a fiend when it comes to acid and mushrooms and stuff like that, but in any stretch of the imagination. But I have tried it, and mushrooms more so than acid. And I can honestly say the first time, or the first couple of times I did mushrooms, it was like this revelation. And I believe I even said to you at the time, it really blew me away how similar the sensations and experiences that I had when I was taking mushrooms, how similar that was to some of these really intense meditations that I'd done. So, it's interesting that there's a connection there at all. And myself, I thought a lot like a lot of people do. Well, these things are just, they just mess up your mind and cause your brain to short circuit. And but if that's the case, how was it that that I was able to achieve the same kind of headspaces and the same kind of sensations and experiences meditating as I did just by taking a handful of mushrooms that some we picked off the ground. Well, I didn't pick them personally, but
Well,
that somebody picked off the ground. It's almost like you can spend years attempting to achieve these states, or you can just take a handful of these and rock and roll for a couple of hours. You know, so and I'll just state for the record, when it comes to hallucinogenics, there's two very important rules that you should always follow, other than being absolutely fucking certain about your supply. But it's set and setting, right? Those are the hallucinogen two commandments, right? It's set and setting. Your mindset going into the experience and the setting that you put yourself in. I would never take any kind of hallucinogenic and go to the mall or, go and watch a violent, scary movie or something. That's just asking for a bad time, asking for a bad trip. It's one of these things that, especially mushrooms, you want to do that like out in nature, next to a stream or in a forest or something like that. And the kind of connection that you feel with these things it's undescribable. These kinds of experiences, it's a lot like a dream in terms of you come back and you have this profound dream and you're trying to explain it to somebody and they're looking at you with this weird look on their face and you're just almost lost in the profoundness of the feelings that are still lingering. But as your day goes on, you find it more and more difficult to articulate what you experienced, and then by the next day or later that evening, it's gone altogether. You just lose it. And that's a lot like these experiences with hallucinogens. So I think, in this case, there's a very specific kind of mood, a setting that they've created for themselves with the summoning rituals and the quote unquote haunted objects.
plus they were into they were into metal, and I love metal. I'm just saying that all the artwork and the atmosphere for metal is, let's face it, a lot of it is death, dying, it's hell, it's skulls, it's crossbones, it's
yes, and that's if that's the world that you're living in, that is setting up a very specific mood and a very specific atmosphere. We're talking about atmosphere here. I don't know if my mic is picking it up, but we got a wicked thunderstorm rolling back in here again now.
Yeah, I'm a little bit envious. Our thunderstorms are like 2 cracks of thunder, and that's it. There's nothing to watch. There's nothing.
The storms in Newfoundland are kind of like the 2-pump chump.
Oh, fuck, are they ever? But there's another interesting thing that you once said to me that I actually heard them say in the movie about the study on DMT. and that was that one person was explaining the experience as taking the filters away from who you are. The
Yes.
whole humanity aspect of who you are as a person. You start going and peeling away the layers, layer by layer by layer by layer, peeling away who you are, your identity, the filters that make you you, the way you see the world.
Well, and that all depends on your dose.
Well, okay, fair enough.
I've been accused of taking what was called the heroic dose every now and then, and that can definitely do that to you. Like it kind of dissolves the personality and the ego, and it strips away the identity. And I think that, that's where a lot of people freak out and panic, right? They're like, "Oh my God, I'm dying," right? And that I've heard people say that, I felt like I was dying. Why did you feel like you were dying?
Well,
Because
that's
my identity was melting away, my individuality.
what's interesting about that though. And this is something they compared in the movie was the comparison between, say, mushrooms, acid, ayahuasca, and pure injection of DMT.
Well, DMT is ayahuasca and DMT are well. There's dimethyltryptamine in ayahuasca.
There is, but they said like the way that they administered it, because this was in a medical setting, it was slightly different.
Oh yeah. Well, ayahuasca you take orally, and normally you can't eat DMT. You have to take an MAOI, which is like a chemical that shuts off certain digestive enzymes in your stomach. So otherwise, your stomach normally breaks down dimethyltryptamine. So injection would be the straight course. You can actually take DMT anally as well, although I've...
it's probably not the most pleasant way to
Well, apparently it goes, because smoking DMT is like a 15, 20 minute, like 7-8 minutes, you're peaking, and then, and then the experience kind of slacks off from there. Injecting it lasts a lot longer. Absorbing it through your anal membrane also is like a half an hour experience. So yeah, the way that you take it is another. I mean, let's make it clear, we're not advocating drug use.
Oh hell no!
We're talking about the effects of hallucinogens and their connection with the paranormal experience.
Well, the thing I wanted to point out was that they made a distinction. Like, some of these guys that were on the for the trial, they were very experienced. They've done everything dozens, hundreds of times, and when they had this straight injection, they said it was a whole different level, and they also said that the comparisons between that experience and near-death experiences were very similar. Like, some people saw angels, they saw, and the fact is when you die, your brain releases DMT, right?
Well, now, and that's another thing, that's often said, but I don't know if it's ever been conclusively proven that it's with the DMT thing. Now, there's also some indication that DMT is released during REM sleep.
Oh,
Small amounts of DMT are released into the brain during REM sleep, and we start to look at this, and of course, dimethyltryptamine is sometimes referred to as the spirit molecule. And I mean it's created in damn near everything. I mean, I know these guys, it's not part of the story in terms of these guys weren't banging DMT, but DMT is like the purest, strongest hallucinogen that man is aware of, or at least that I'm aware of, and I guess you could say it's also like the purest experience, because another thing that they found was that the higher the dose, the more spiritual the experience, the more intense and profound the experience. However, the higher the dose, the less of the experience the person was able to recount. They would just stammer or something like it was amazing. It was like it
Yeah.
was like God, like you can't and I understand that. Like I really do, because I've been in a similar situation with just meditating. It was amazing. It was like nothing else I've ever experienced, and I can't process, or I can't get it across to you in a way where it is as meaningful to you as it is, or as the experience was to me. And I think that's the problem with a lot of these studies. I mean, there's not a lot of understanding what a hallucinogen is, or sometimes they're referred to as ethnogens. Um, there's a lot of disagreement about the actual effect that it has. I mean, psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, or psilocybin cubensi mushrooms, actually increases visual acuity. A small amount of psilocybin cubensi mushroom actually makes your vision sharper to a measurable degree. There's actually a significant percentage that it does that. So I mean, there's right there, right there. This is a scientifically proven fact that it has a direct impact on your and in this case a positive impact on your perception, your ability to visually perceive objects. And there's a famous experiment with two parallel lines that begin to diverge from one another at like a fraction of a degree at some point, and then by the time you get to the end of it, they're they've diverged over an inch, but it's so gradual that it's very difficult for people to identify where, at what point these lines are beginning to diverge. And anybody taking small amounts of psilocybin can identify that point a lot sooner than somebody who isn't on psilocybin. So there isn't even a lot of consensus on what a hallucination is, right? I mean, we know that there's crazy people that hallucinate. They have auditory hallucinations, and visual hallucinations, and aromatic ones. And some of them think they're sitting there eating a sandwich, and they're not. But they can taste a sandwich, and it feels like a sandwich, and it smells like a sandwich, right? And then there's and that's somebody we just say, well, his fucking brain is broken. And then there's somebody else who eats a little plant, and he has very minor visual hallucinations. I mean, I've done a lot of mushrooms, and I've never seen purple elephants and all this crazy shit you see in the movies. That's just straight up not true. That's just media or entertainment, using it for entertainment purposes. So anybody basing their knowledge of these things, to throw this story out, throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing, just because these guys were taking some mushrooms or doing some acid, it's that's not fair.
Well, I think that
it doesn't illegitimize their experience.
I think that that's the point, right? Like, and I'm glad that's the angle that you came with it, and I'm glad that that's something that was discussed. And I know that Hugo pointed that out. I mean, it's just like, for me, right? One of the things that I take on an occasional basis is clonazepam. It's not a heavy pharmaceutical by any means, but
every time you say that, I always want to go do 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 do.
Okay, well,
clonazepam. Do 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 do. Sorry,
I don't even know what that commercial. I guess it's a commercial.
It was something that the Muppets used to do.
Okay. Well, anyway, it's something that I've taken to calm myself. And for me, like, I mean, just like a lot of these drugs, they got all these warnings on the labels: don't operate heavy machinery, don't drive, blah blah blah. But for me, I don't even like it. Hardly touches me. I hardly feel it. I hardly like. It doesn't really do anything. Yet you could take a much weaker drug of that family, like an Ativan. If I gave my wife an Ativan, she's asleep in 10 minutes, right? And clonazepam is a heavier version of that, and I could take 2 or 3 of them, and it hardly touches me, right? So when we're talking about these guys who do, acid and mushrooms and stuff like that, these guys know how they react to it. They're very experienced with it. They've done it for a long time. And as Ryan said, the hallucinations generally are, much less so than media would have you believe if you're not a user and you don't know from firsthand experience. And I guess that's the whole thing to take with this is that. When he says that he knows it wasn't the mushrooms, he wasn't peaking, he knows how he was, and then the room did all this stuff, but he knows he wasn't high. Well, that's the point, right? It's that he knows that. He knows how he reacts to this stuff. He knows, you know what I mean? Like, so don't discount it just because, your understanding of the drug, you just assume that would be the case. What it sounds like to me, very much so, is that this is what actually happened. And as for the suit of armor and all that stuff, they're not high 24/7. So a lot of the stuff that they experienced probably was while they were sober, right? Noticing that the statue had changed positions, and when the thing fell, when the chandelier fell and almost killed the dog. And I believe he said that was pre-stoner days, before they even got into that. So, they knowed it. Before they even got into the drugs. They knew as soon as they dug up those bricks and antique silverware, that's when the stuff began to start happening, and it followed them throughout their whole life, and it just continued even when they got into the drugs. So yeah, that's Hugo's story. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I particularly enjoyed the visualizing the room coming to life with the Iron Maiden poster coming out of the wall and the figurines coming up and taunting him. And it must have been scary as hell for him, but I enjoyed visualizing it. I picture the room going all red, right, and all these little demonic figurines saying the nastiest stuff, and him curled up on his bed, and with Eddie, is that what his name was? The mascot for Iron Maiden? Eddie? Oh, I don't know what his name is. I know what he looks like. I used to draw him on pictures when I was younger.
Yeah, I don't think I want that guy crawling out of off a fucking poster, all the Grudge style, crawling across the room towards me with his little demon eyes and skull face.
You're all skin and bones. Can I offer you a sandwich?
Yeah.
But anyway, that's Hugo's story. We are going to be covering the. We got crazy stories. I'm telling you, with the near-death experiences and with the crypt zoology stuff, it's there. It's ready to be done. It's just my internet. So, hopefully we'll be getting them soon. I'm supposed to be hooked up to my new ISP on the 11th. So when we do get them out, though, keep your eyes out, because there's some really fantastic stories there. You guys are going to eat it up. And if you have, an effed up story of your own, you can submit that to us at effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. We'll get it on the website, and we'll get it in a podcast. And with that said, I hope you enjoyed the show. I will catch you next time.
Thank you so much for listening, everybody. Have a great night.
And that is purely because my internet is intermittent, very much so right now. In fact, we're kind of gambling right now to get this episode done, and that's why we haven't started our near-death experience or cryptozoology weeks. We're going to think Shark Week, and that's what we're doing with those two topics. It's going to be 1 week, 4 or 5 episodes on near-death experiences, and the next one is going to be 4 or 5 episodes on cryptozoology beasts. We just haven't done it yet because my internet is so unreliable, and I am switching providers, but I'm not going to get that done until August 11th, unfortunately. So we felt best to wait until we can, be dependable with that. So we're gambling trying to get this one out there just so you have something in the meantime. And also, if you have an effed up story on the paranormal, or you have pictures or video, we'd like to get it. You can send that to us at the official site, effedupstories.com. That's effedupstories.com. Go to the menu, hit submissions, fill out the form, hit submit. We'll get it on the website, and we'll get it into a podcast. And with that having been said, we're going to jump into Hugo's story, which on the website is titled Digging Up Trouble. So this goes back to when Hugo was in middle school, and he had met these guys, Bob and Tony, and they were brothers who were 2 years apart. And, he said they didn't really hang out until they got into high school. And they were all stoners, and they were into, drawing gravestones and crosses on their book covers. And, they listened to Ozzy and, Black Sabbath. And, those two guys had two older brothers, and they were named Steve and Dan. And they were also 2 years apart, but they were about 5 years older. And, they had this doom rock band. And so really, I can kind of relate a little bit to these guys. Not that I was super into drugs or anything, but, I was into a lot of the, heavy rock and metal and that scene, the occasional Toke and stuff like that. But anyway, so, this was his crew, right? And anyway, they ended up becoming close friends, Hugo and Bob and Tony, and some other guys as well. And once they were, old enough, just like a lot of us in high school, they had cars, and there's usually one person's house that everybody gathers at. Like when I grew up, just about everybody came to my house. And in this guy's case, everybody went to Bob and Tony's house, and that's where they all hung out. And anyway, the first time that Hugo went to their house, he was really creeped out by the fact that they had this creepy suit of armor, like a full suit of armor, in their house, right? And I mean, it was standing in the corner, and it even had a sword. And it was like this medieval knight, full face shield, helmet. And he said it was really creepy, this thing was complete from head to toe, and it was just a strange thing to find in somebody's house. And they told him that this statue would sometimes change its pose all on its own. And so he probed them, for half an hour to find out, what's the story behind this, movie, this possessed statue of armor. And so they gave him the backstory. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight we will be doing another user submission. This one sent in, this is his alias, by the way. You've probably seen him in the comments. It's Hugo Fuck Yourself. And it sounds a lot like You Go Fuck Yourself. And that's kind of his whole, that's the whole idea. Anyway, his story is really, it's really interesting. Has to do with it when he was younger and he met these guys who had moved to their town from away, and anyway, they had brought some trouble with them with some old silverware and strange stuff that they dug up in one of the guys' yards. And this involves some pretty crazy stuff. So before we get into that, just a couple things I want to shoot out there. It has been a little while since we've had an episode up. Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.